Hello, 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 everybody. I'm wired for sound, in case you didn't notice. Welcome to all of you. We have guests from far-flung areas here. I'm not going to repeat all their names because I can't remember them all. But I've got sailors, neighbors, old friends, new friends, people who've taught me how to speak, people who've taught me all kinds of things. Anyway, it's great to have you here, warming my heart. As I said, I feel like a rock star with all these things are going on. Now, someplace hidden in this crowd might be Topsy, the love of my life, but she is coming with her son, so she may be making a later appearance. No project like this could be completed without a lot of help and a lot of support, and a substantial amount of money, I might add, too. Let me run through here. Is Julie Schaefer, is she here?
I'll go get her.
All right. Julie she did all the paperwork around the office, and we couldn't have continued without her. The strong voice that you just heard comes from Mary Lauer. Mary.
She's going to stay at her post, Kingston.
What?
She's staying at her post.
Oh, she's staying at her post. Well,
Oh, there she is.
there she is. And I think she has a lot of these over there.
She has a lot of them.
Yeah. All right, and then Susan Everson did the design work here, which for the book was very important. I don't know who he is, but I want you to look carefully at the cover and look at the clothes I decided to wear today. Every book needs a book designer, and that was Susan, and then we had illustrations. I got carried away by some other books I saw where there were hand-drawn illustrations, and I thought they'd add something to the book. So we got Taya Morley, and she did a lot of good ones, as you'll see in there, sketches. And of course, nothing's complete without my daughter, Allison. Allison, you're in the other room, but you're being spoken about. For my well-being in these last few years, Peter Jewett. Is Peter here? Yeah. Peter Jewett, hey, there he is. And and Connie Blanchard is in the other room working hard on the hors d'oeuvres that we have passed. Hey. So there are a lot more names that we could go through, but I can't remember them all. So anyway, we're going to skip on to the general manager of this whole affair. Nothing would have happened. You wouldn't be in this room. I wouldn't have these books to flog if it weren't for Carol Pine. Where is Carol? She pulled all the pieces together and made it happen.
Mary Lauer.
I thought I mentioned Mary Lauer, but you didn't hear.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I did. I mentioned her once, but I'll mention her a second time. She deserves a second mention. Mary is the one that's electrified me today. And these gentlemen over here, Mike and his assistant, are proceeding to pull me into the 21st century, although I do it reluctantly. But I'm under their sway at this point in time. Now, running down the list of dignitaries, you've heard some accordion music out there, and that's provided by Larry Johnson, who was one of my new old found relatives who lives out 90 miles some west of here in near Wilmer, Minnesota. And we just discovered that he was an accordion player, which was a surprise. So he's included in the program. And of course, he'll be accompanied by my regular pianist that I like so much, Rick Carlson. Rick's over there by the piano right now. Harking back to my comment about the electricity here, the video today is capturing all this on a thing called a live stream link. I thought the links were something for your shirts, but not in this case. And Michael, our tech wizard, is making all this happen. Michael, raise your hand. Wandering through the room periodically will be a photographer, and he's on the straight and narrow. His name is Byron Douglas. And Byron, you want to raise your hand? Don't be scared when he moves in on you. Now, here's the plan for this afternoon. Next, I'm going to do some readings from the book. We've cut them down. They're short. They're designed to trigger in your mind some questions and ideas about what to pursue later on when we get to that portion of it. And the final logistical note, this is an old house, and when it was built, I think bathrooms were not in vogue. But the bathroom to be used is out in this direction. Just go out there and somebody will point their way into the corner. A word of caution, don't try to lock the door. Get somebody to stand in front of it on the other side or whatever. We've had guests that have been in there up to 45 minutes before we could get them out. Well, so be it. On we go. Now, you've got to travel with me in a time warp here. And our first stop is 1946, and I'm 20 years old. I'm at Yale University, and the only big reason I went there was because the OCD, the oldest college daily. I was an ink-stained wretch at that time, and I wanted to work on this famous college newspaper. Well, I guess I didn't do my due diligence, but I got there properly during the war and discovered that the oldest college daily had been postponed for the end of the war. So second choice was a college radio station. So I went to work on that. And that's what I really spent a lot of time on, more than I should have. I was 20 years old in my senior year at Yale. And I returned to Minneapolis during the Christmas break in December and landed a summer job at WDGY, which was a pop music station housed on the top floor of the old Nicollet Hotel in downtown Minneapolis. I was a staff announcer for the summer. Going back a bit, by the spring of '47, my senior year at Yale, I was no more a Yale scholar than Handsome Dan, the bulldog, our mascot. I dropped out of Yale to my mother's horror, returned to Minneapolis, and reported for my new summer radio job. By the fall of that year, without an audition, I secured a spot as a play-by-play football sports announcer doing the football games on the East Coast of the United States. My family didn't intervene and insist that I return to Yale and finish. It would have been different if my dad had been alive. So I left Minneapolis in mid-September '47 with no forwarding address or phone number. I cut off contact with my family, determined to make my own way. As the new and low man on the broadcasting team, I was assigned the less important games, and these included the season openers for both Yale and Harvard. And one memory of that time was that Bobby Kennedy came on as a substitute tackle in Harvard's opening game. His family name was already becoming famous. I lived hand to hand as a novice sports announcer. A kind advertising man whom I met on the 20th Century Limited train a few years before came to my rescue. When I was in New York City and couldn't find lodging, he arranged for me to stay at the Williams Club on College Club on 39th Street, providing I did not occupy a regular room. So I slept upstairs at the pool table at no charge. I was determined to make a career out of this unpredictable yet promising business where wide-eyed beginners with a gift of gab could strike it rich. A friend of my family, Walter Ringer, opened one big door for me. He was well connected with NBC and the people at NBC television, which was just getting going. He found a trial spot for me on the Cavalcade of Sports for Gillette. Friday nights, they broadcast fights featuring boxing matches pitting average but aggressive contestants. I was granted an announcing audition in November 1947, but that's as far as it went. I didn't know much about boxing and felt that my performance was subpar. 2 moments of truth changed my whole outlook on radio broadcasting. The station director at Minneapolis WDGY radio took me aside. "Look at that guy over there," he said softly. "He's an average announcer with a high school education. He's 35 now. His main sport is chasing women and drinking a little too much. Is that what you want for your life, Kingston?" Then the news director at Philadelphia station WPTZ told me this: "I've watched you go from town to town for months. I know your story. I've seen it before. I know how determined you are to make it in sports broadcasting. But Kingston, listen to me. Go back to school. Earn your degree. You'll never regret it." I was lucky. Those 2 older men took an interest in me and told me the truth. Moreover, I was willing to listen. Well, now we're going to shift gears, and we're going up to the year 1950. I'm 24 years old, and I have shifted to a career in international work. And I was with the old automobile company that many of you may not remember, Studebaker, made cars and trucks. And I had had experience in the United States, a little training. I'd been in Europe, living in Brussels, and then they sent me down to Venezuela. As I said, I was 24 years old. Young American expatriates, called expats, the world over usually find each other. And Caracas was no exception. Within a few days, I knew that the Hotel Potomac in the San Bernardino area of Caracas was the place to meet and be met. I should point out that that pronunciation is the Spanish version of Potomac, but we always called it the Potomac. It was a haven for young and highly paid people, traveling salesmen, airline pilots, representatives of American companies. Many expats, such as me, did not have costly offices in the city because our companies preferred to ship their goods directly from the U.S. factories. Most of us were unmarried men, attracted by the high salaries in this high-flying economy. And I might add, Venezuela was booming in those days. Most of the female expats were school teachers and secretaries, some of them bilingual, who had also opted for good pay and adventure. It was an electric mix. After a few days, I met a new friend, Austin Moore, from the eastern shore of Maryland, who invited me to a cocktail party for expats at his apartment. With that, my life changed. Across a crowded room, I saw a 5'2" enchantress whom I wanted to know. She was Doris Eileen Calderwood, who the American State Department had just transferred to Caracas. She had a warm smile, an engaging personality, and obvious intelligence. I was smitten. In my international travels, I had had little time for romance up to that point. I was globetrotting and frankly working too hard. My last pairing was in my school years, and even that took a back seat to my extracurricular activities. In recent years, at that time, I'd made a decision. I would not marry a foreigner. I'd seen too many Americans in Mexico and Europe make that choice after World War II, settle in their adopted countries, lose their natural identities, and rue their romance. No, I would marry an American girl who wanted to travel the world with me, and Doris Calderwood seemed like a step in the right direction. Now we have a pause in the activity, and it's open for questions. You take over.
Please let me know, and I'll bring the microphone to you.
I think Kingston may be too bashful. My name is Jack Spillane. He's maybe too bashful to mention that when he was with Procter Gamble, as I was, he was his importance to the company was about number 8. Yeah, out of maybe 40,000 worldwide and so forth. My importance to the company was number 3 from the bottom.
Thank you, Jack. Does anybody else have any questions? Excuse me.
Maybe you want to leave us hanging, but did you go back to Yale, and what about the girl?
Well, I guess the answer from a cagey codger would be, you got to read the book. But I'll give you some inside information. Yes, I did. I went back to Yale. I pled with the admissions officer. He was doubtful that I could make it. I said I could. I went back and went to every class, didn't skip any classes, didn't have any outside activities other than the occasional radio effort, and got a B minus. Not a great score, because I had been at Blake School, I'd been, not magna cum laude, cum laude. But it was good for Yale, I thought, at that time, and good for me. So that's answer one. And now, what's the second question? The girl? Well, we're coming to that. I think I better hold off on that one until we get past that. Any other queries on these travails and travels? No? Well, it was a pretty exciting time, I got to tell you. I went to a lot of different countries at that young period of my life.
Were you
Had to learn a lot of languages too. And,
were you flying back and forth, or were you
Well, I
going
know-
by ship?
No, in those days, well, I was flying, yeah, in piston planes, so it took twice as long as it takes today. It was, now it's 6 hours to Europe, and it was 12 hours in those days. So knocked around, but it was fun, it was exhilarating, and it was challenging at the same time. But the languages are the thing that struck me at the time. I'd never been a particular had interest in languages, but my first job, I was up in Minneapolis, and my brother called me up, and he worked for the Studebaker company, and that's how I got the job. And he said, Kingston, you've shown an interest in international work. Would you like to come down here and work in Mexico? I can get a job for you as a car and truck salesman at one of the dealerships here. And I said, why not? I wasn't married. I didn't have any other reasons to stay here. It was the middle of the winter, so why not? So off I went to Mexico, and I really had to learn Spanish in a hurry. And that's in the book, too. I'll tell you some of my adventures there.
What part of Mexico?
Pardon? What part? It was Mexico City. And I was living in a boarding house in the southern part of the city at that time, and would didn't have a car. Here I worked for a car company, but they didn't give me a car. So I learned to use the por puesto system. That means per person. And that, in other words, it's the jitney. And these cars would go up and down the main streets, and they'd have painted on the windshield going to so-and-so and how much money it would cost. And then you hopped in with 3 other people and the driver, and off you'd go down the street. So it was a great way to learn Spanish because that's all they talked at the time, and I did my best to participate. I also learned that you've got to be careful if you get into one of those jitney cabs, at least at that time. They were full of fleas. So I'd have a lot of itching on the back of my legs after I'd been transported to wherever I wanted to go.
What language did you speak in Venezuela?
The language, well, I tried to, I still spoke English, but I tried to master Spanish, and I have to say I did. And that comes up later on as well, when I had 2 tours in Venezuela. And the first time around, I really was immersed in the language. I would disappear into the back area of the country for 4 weeks, 5 weeks or something like that, and not speak any English. And I had a strange experience. I came back to Caracas one time, and I had trouble speaking English. I look at something, and the Spanish word would come for, that didn't last long, a day or so, but it intensified. That's the way to learn a language, is be thrown into it and not have an opportunity to speak your own tongue. Go ahead.
How many other languages did you speak at that time?
Well, I didn't speak it. I had an education in French, which in the United States at that time was taught like Latin. You wrote it down and all. You never spoke it. So I had that background at Blake Country Day School and at Yale. But I really, so those, I had Spanish and English, and then they transferred me to Brussels in the French-speaking part of Belgium. And I lived at a boarding house there where all they spoke was French. And that's, I'm not sure, that's in the book, but I'll tell you a little bit about it. It was a fascinating experience, being a couple years, 3 or 4 years after the war. And they would bring in all kinds of people that would rent rooms for a day, a week, or something like that. And it was a real potpourri of Europeans. There was one man who had been a submarine captain for the Germans in World War I. There was another guy who had was part of the new management of the newly founded and created country of, which country was that? Yugoslavia. He was one of my buddies. We struggled with English together, or French, or whatever it was we were speaking at that time. So that was it. And then later had to, that's again in the book, I had to learn to speak Italian. And Italian was a great time. I spent a couple of years, wonderful years in Italy. My housing accommodations were all downhill after that. I had a great time. And finally, I tackled the hard one, German. And that was, finally I was able to get up on my feet and give a talk to the sales department off the cuff. But that's as far as I went. I had great admiration for these foreign dignitaries that speak English when they're interviewed by national television in the United States, and how good their English is and how hard it must have been for them to learn the language other than their own to be that fluent. I did study Latin at Blake too. Well, all those verbs and all coming at the end of the sentence, yes. I am going to the store tomorrow is I am tomorrow to the store going.
And with that, we're going to give Kingston a little bit of a break to get a drink of water, and everyone else to get a refreshment. And we'll be back to some more readings in just a short amount of time. Thank you.
All right, everybody, fasten your seatbelts. We're going to be traveling. We now move on to the year 1960. I'm 34 years old, and this is 10 years later from my last episode. I had changed companies. In fact, I'd been fired by Studebaker, but we'll come to that later. I joined Procter Gamble, worked in the United States, Canada for some time, a surprise 21 months in the U.S. Army in the middle of all this. Then I never fired a gun in anger, so I was on everybody's side. Anyways, I've been in Great Britain, and all of a sudden, I found myself back in Venezuela 10 years later. It was still booming, but there was revolution in the air. Fidel Castro had succeeded in taking over Cuba, and he betrayed his followers. He said he was going to put in democracy and free enterprise and all that, but turned out he was a communist, and he wanted everybody else to be a communist. And he didn't like the government in Venezuela, which was free enterprise, democratically elected president, etc. So he agitated with his followers down there to see if they could stir things up and eventually overthrow the government. So I was pitched into that, and we had bullets flying near our factory and all kinds of exciting things. And now I take up the story. We had a P&G plant manager in Venezuela who was a canny, tough veteran of World War II in the British Navy. His name was Bob Cook. I recall visiting Bob in his Caracas office and sitting by a glass window that looked out on the street. 6 inches above my head was a bullet hole in shatterproof glass. Bob left the bullet hole there. It had a particularly dramatic effect on our visitors from headquarters in Cincinnati. Bob's right-hand man at our plant was Max Kament, a Slovakian who'd been in the German army. Many ex-Axis soldiers had departed war-torn Europe to seek employment and a better life in South America. Bob and Max designed and built a series of 8 bunkers around our plant with walls reinforced with steel plates to withstand small arms assault. They added more protection with coiled concertina barbed wire fences and bright moving floodlights. We employed 25 armed men inside the bunkers around the clock with semi-automatic weapons. Searchlights constantly combed the area at night. Most Venezuelans feared dogs, so Max let loose his 2 high-strung German shepherds at night to patrol the grounds. When we realized that some of our men might be a bit trigger-happy, after all, they got to play war during the day and night, we gave them walkie-talkies and insisted that only one central commander could give the order to shoot. Not appropriate to shoot and kill Venezuelans by an American firm at that time. We even dug a 10-foot wide ditch between the cyclone fence surrounding our plant and the bunkers. Were there landmines in the ditch? We never discouraged the rumors. Now we're going to jump to 1964. It was and by this time I had crawled up the corporate ladder and become the general manager of Procter Gamble Germany, which was our biggest international subsidiary at the time. I think continues to carry that reputation. I was 64 years old, and my home base was now Germany. Americans were marching against the Vietnam War. Martin Luther King brought the civil rights movement to life in Memphis, Tennessee, and was assassinated on April 4. Presidential candidate Robert Kennedy was killed in June, and Richard Nixon was elected the 37th President of the United States that fall. My family and I watched our home country from a distance, and at a closer range, we also saw a cultural revolution in Germany and France, where students protested against the traditionalism and political authority of the government. They were called the 68ers in Germany. Periodically, senior P&G executives toured Europe, spending 2 to 3 days in each country, plus some pleasant vacation time with their wives. At our P&G office in Frankfurt, I was preparing for a visit that meant far more than I imagined at the time. Neil McElroy had returned to P&G after his stint as Secretary of Defense under President Eisenhower, and he'd stepped up to chair the board. It was an appropriate return post for a man of McElroy's stature. My boss, Jake Lingle, and McElroy came to Frankfurt for what I thought was an informal look-see. Our German business was booming, and I had reason to be proud. We needed more office space, and we're on track to construct our own headquarters. I decided we'd take on the job ourselves. The whole project, including the real estate, cost us 27 million Deutschmarks. That's about $7 million then, which turned out to be a significant bargain. When McElroy and Lingle arrived in Frankfurt, I was under a lot of pressure, and I wasn't at my best. Perhaps I seemed a bit dismissive or distracted. Looking back on that seminal visit, I must have said and done things that didn't inspire confidence in either man. I did not appreciate the gravity of this state visit until later. It turned out to be an audition for a promotion and even possible advancement to the top P&G International job. Jake wanted to retire in a few years, and I was in his sights. I was his guy, I should say. He had coached me and trained me, and I had made him proud. But I didn't measure up at this all-important meeting. I didn't realize what was going on, but it's clear to me now. Jake was so disappointed, he barely talked to me on the way to the airport. I'd squandered my chance. I felt bad about it, but I thought, Fletcher, you get good things and bad things in life. Pull up your socks and see what you can do. If I didn't find satisfaction in a challenging new assignment in another year with P&G, I would go elsewhere. As a young man, my poor performance at Yale and my flight of fancy with sports broadcasting taught me how to bounce back from disappointment. I could do it again.
Are there any questions from the audience? I'd like to come and bring the microphone to you if you do have a question or comment.
Where in Frankfurt, in Germany? Were you in Frankfurt when you were in Germany?
Yes. Our offices were in Frankfurt, and if you know Frankfurt, I was living in Königstein, which means Kingston, as a matter of fact, in the hills surrounding Frankfurt. A very pleasant place. We had a wonderful time in Germany. We loved the Germans. Their characters, in my view, is closer to the American character than any other group in Europe, including the Brits. We're separated by a language. Okay. Anything else? Any other? There's a hand up.
One moment, please. We want this for the stream.
Kingston, how fluent in German did you become, and were you at when you first began your stint in Germany?
Well, I'm always suspicious of people saying that they speak a foreign language. My fluency was to the point that I could get up in front of the sales force and give a talk, ad lib, about what we were going to do and what our next offers were and that. I could not go on television the way foreign people come, foreign executives and particularly politicians, know English in this country. My German wasn't that good. I really would have had to spend more time there. But I worked very hard at it. And I could read it, and that was fun to be able to read the news, although I didn't read the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, if you know the Germans. That's the New York Times of Germany. But I could read the, what was it, I can't think of the name right now. The picture, it was the paper of the common man, and I could read that easily. And I remember one day I was traveling in my car with the driver. Those were the days. The general managers had drivers in cars. That's gone now. And we went by a group of workmen who were there, and of course, I could understand what they were saying. And they looked at me reading this paper, the paper of the people. And the Germans always believe you should stick to your area of expertise. And they're very conscious of that. And I could hear them saying, "What the hell's he doing reading that paper?" Well, I spent a lot of time on the German language. It was a head breaker.
Gene, Kingston, would you tell us how you met your wife in Europe?
How I met her? Well, I covered that a little earlier, that she was at a cocktail party down in Venezuela, and I'd been invited by a friend of mine to that, and I met her there. I'd been in Venezuela about 7 days, and she'd been there about 7 or 8 days. She had just come from Cairo, Egypt, where she had completed a 2.5-year stay with the American embassy there, and had some exciting times because, if you'll recall, that was the time the State of Israel was created. And all the messages to Washington at that time came through Cairo, through the embassy at Cairo. And she could see all these because she had clearance for it. And it was an interesting thing. She reported this to me. She said the American Foreign Service officers, to a man, were very opposed to the United States recognizing the State of Israel as the first one. They said, "You recognize it, we realize that, but don't be the first." And later I read Harry Truman's biography. He said he had as much pressure on that as any other issue while he was in office. And the U.S. was the first country to recognize the State of Israel at that time.
Kingston, it's Susan Hamill, Betty and Dick's daughter. You've lived through so much from the Roaring 20s through now, and our country is going through a lot right now. And I know your book is about the past, but I'm really curious what you think about the future. Are you optimistic about the future?
Well, I have to pass on that because politics are a dangerous ground to tread on. So I'll just say that I'm confident that our democracy is not in danger. How's that for a soporific answer? I think we're going to be all right. We'll come through. After a look at the Civil War, see the feelings that existed at that time and the divisions in the country. So that's the end of the tale at this time. There's a lot more in the book, and I'm so delighted that you all could come today and enjoy it. I'm honored.